Hello, and welcome to the Atlantic Debrief, the Atlantic Council Europe Center's internet show and podcast on the most pressing issues impacting the transatlantic relationship today. My name is Rachel Rizzo, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. And it is my pleasure today to welcome to the Debrief Manuel Muñiz, who is the Provost of IE University in Madrid and former State Secretary in the Spanish Foreign Ministry. Manuel, thanks so much for being with us today. A very warm welcome.
Thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So as you've been watching closely from Madrid, we've all been watching this closely from Washington as well. Spanish voters went to the polls on Sunday for the Spanish parliamentary elections. And with all of the votes counted, there is no apparent political party or coalition who has won enough votes to be able to form a government. Seems like there's a lot to unpack here on what these results, or lack thereof, I guess I should say, might mean for Spanish politics as well as Spain's presidency of the Council of the European Union. So with that, I want to jump right in. We're looking at far-right nationalism that has sort of burgeoned across Europe over the last few years. And this election similarly was forecasted to propel a right-wing coalition to the forefront of Spanish politics. That didn't happen. In fact, it seems like the right wing underperformed in Sunday's election. How do you explain that?
Well, they did underperform, and that's probably one of the main reasons why the bloc on the right of the spectrum is unable to form a government, because the two groups, the Conservative Party and then Vox, which is the far right party in Spain, do not reach the 176 MP mark that would allow them to form a government. And the Conservative Party grew in votes and in MPs, but Vox plummeted, and they lost a large chunk of their parliamentary group. And I think the reason for that is that their ideology and Spanish voters do not agree with some of the fundamental tenets that Vox has been putting on the table. And they've done so very loudly since the end of May, because at the end of May, we had regional and local elections in Spain. And Vox has been fundamental to the formation of local and regional governments in a number of places around Spain, together with the Conservatives. And in those negotiations and in those processes of local and regional government formation, they've put forward topics and issues that I think a lot of Spaniards disagree with. Like, they've insisted on taking down LGBT flags in a number of places around Spain. At some point, they came out in Valencia, in one of our regions on the Mediterranean, in the formation of the regional government there, and they actually questioned whether there was something as gender violence, and they wanted to change the labeling and the naming of that, and that reopened a debate which had been closed in Spain for decades, with a consensus across the right and the left around the fact that there is something like gender violence that we need to fight, and that there have to be initiatives around that. So I think they haven't done themselves any favors. They've been very frank and open about their positions, but that has led to a huge plummeting of support for them in these elections, and that's probably the more positive news coming out of the election.
So that's interesting that you say this, because when you look at far-right parties in the rest of Europe, the Brothers of Italy in Italy, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, Marine Le Pen's party in France, they seem to be doing better than the far-right party in Spain. So there's been a lot of discussion, I think, over the last couple of years, especially over the last year, actually, about whether or not Europe itself is moving to the right. Do you think you can extrapolate a broader message for Europe based on what happened on Sunday, or is that taking it a little bit too far?
No. I mean, I think there clearly is a message, and had the extreme right done very well in the elections, it would have been another element in a longer chain of the extreme right entering national governments in European countries, with the president, of course, of Italy, but we have Hungary, we have Poland, we have other places around Europe. And it would have, I think, contributed to a momentum of moving towards the far right, maybe followed by elections in France, in Germany. In Germany, we just had the recent polling with Alternative for Germany surpassing the SPD, the Social Democrats, in the polls. And then, of course, the European Parliament elections next year, where the right and the Eurosceptics are poised to do quite well. So had that been the case, I think Spain would have contributed to this momentum. We haven't. And that's, I think, very good news. And that also speaks about, I think, the Spanish electorate in particular. So there's a European dimension to this and a Spanish one. And Spanish voters tend to position themselves, on the ideological spectrum around the 4, 5, 6, 10 being far right, 1 being far left. So it's a fairly moderate electorate. And if you look at the result of the elections, that's what the result tells you. Because between the socialists and the conservatives, which is the center left and center right, basically they captured a huge proportion of the MPs and a huge proportion of the vote. So I think that speaks positively about Spain and our electorate.
I think it does too. So when you contrast what happened with the right wing, there were also expectations that the socialists weren't going to perform very well, but they performed better than forecasted. Was that a surprise for you? It seems like it was a surprise for everyone.
Well, it was a surprise for everyone because most of the polls indicated the opposite, that the socialists would lose votes, would lose MPs compared to the 2019 elections, which were the last general elections we held in Spain. They did better. They gained MPs, they gained votes, despite a very tough and rough legislature. I mean, an incredibly complicated number of years with the COVID pandemic, the effects of the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and other issues that have affected the Spanish economy. And the socialists have done extraordinarily well. And I think that is also a testament to the management of these crises, but also the response of the electorate on the left to the possibility of the far right entering the national institutions, the national government, for the first time since the Franco regime ended, in Spain in the 70s. So I think it's a combination of these two. But what it means in essence now, and this is why this is so extraordinary, is the conservatives won, but the socialists are truly the party that now has the greater capacity to align the parliamentary votes needed to constitute and sustain a government. So in fact, the socialists have practically won the elections. They are the ones that are now working more decidedly to align other parties in the establishment of a sufficient majority for an investiture vote in the coming months. The leader of the Conservative Party is still trying to gather sufficient votes, but to be quite frank, I think they're simply not there. So the ball will pass to the leader of the Socialist Party, the current PM, and then he will try, and he has a much, much higher probability of succeeding than the leader of the Conservative Party. If he does, we will have another government. If he doesn't, we will then go for a new round of elections at the end of the year, beginning of 2024, and we will have an interim government from now until then that will take care of matters, including the European presidency that Spain holds for the next few months.
Okay. So over the next few months, the potential for the creation of a new government, when you look at Germany, for example, a grand coalition between the CDU and the Social Dems has been something we've seen for a long time. Not now, but historically. That's not something that really happens or has historically happened in Spain, if I understand that correctly. So do you think there's a potential for a grand coalition here, or maybe not?
Politics in Spain since the 70s and the establishment of democracy has been bipartisan. So the conservatives and the socialists have alternated in power. The first coalition government that we ever had was the one that has just ended between socialists and Podemos. So in fact, the culture of coalitions is not very well established. It's quite recent in Spain. And there is now talk, particularly from the business world and others, of trying to have the socialists and the conservatives come together and establish a grand coalition of some kind that enables governance. I think that is very unlikely to happen. We had a very rough campaign with a very tough set of messages coming from both sides of the debate about the other side, and I think that doesn't bode well for a grand coalition. I think what you're going to see is the conservatives trying to muster support in the right, plus a few small parties that would allow them to reach that 176 MP number that I mentioned. I don't think that's going to work. And then you're going to have the socialists do the same, trying to align both the left, but also the regionalist and nationalist parties to try to reach that figure. And I think that might in fact be successful. I think that's what we're headed for. And I think that's what's much more likely.
Okay. And how does the Catalan separatist movement play into what might happen over the next few months?
Well, it does in an extraordinarily sort of central way that I think few would have predicted a few weeks ago. Because if you look at the numbers that both blocs have, both the right and the left end up actually quite close to the majority that is required for the formation of government. But there's one party that will be absolutely central to who actually gets above that 176 number, and that is Junts, which is a Catalan nationalist party, and which was central to the process, which was the push towards Catalan independence, the unsuccessful push that we lived a few years ago, and that has remained very staunch and actually very radical in its positions about the role of Catalonia within Spain. So now, sort of paradoxically, Junts is central to the formation of the Spanish national government. So there's a dialogue that has began between the national parties and Junts, and the Socialist Party and Junts, in an attempt to try to bring them into this coalition, at least for the formation of government. They might have to, there are two options here. They might have to simply abstain to allow the Socialists to obtain the necessary votes for the formation of government, or depending on a final few set of votes that are being counted as we speak, particularly the external vote, the vote from abroad, that might change a few of the numbers, Junts might actually have to vote positively for the formation of government. So these, depending on how this ends up sort of falling, Junts' commitment to the establishment and sustainment of the government might be more or less intense. But in any of those two circumstances, Junts will need to agree to that. And that means that there's a negotiation ongoing about Catalonia, resources that might go to the region, competences for the region, possibly the celebration of a consultation, of a referendum on independence for the region or not. It wouldn't be binding because the Spanish constitution doesn't allow for that, but maybe there's a consultation that is non-binding, that is agreed upon with the regional government. There are issues about pardons for some of the leaders of the pro-independence movement that were condemned by Spanish tribunals. So in fact, it is relatively central now to these negotiations what is agreed with Junts. And we shouldn't take for granted that an agreement will be possible. It might simply not be possible at the end of the day, and we might have to go for elections, national elections. Once again, we're going to find out in a few weeks.
So this is interesting that you say this. I mean, the issue of Catalonia is sort of, at least for those of us that watch Spain and watch European politics, it's there, but it's on the back burner. So you're saying there's a chance that this could become actually pretty central to the formation and future of the next Spanish government, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, so some of these issues will, but there are also negotiations with the Basque nationalists and the Galician nationalists. So it is the regions and the regional parties that are now central. I mean, most of them are. It just happens that Junts is the last one. I think it might be the toughest one to bring on board for the sustainment of the government. But I mean, this is a negotiation between the central parties and all of these regional parties in trying to bring them on board. On the Catalan dossier, I think it's still lingering. I think we're very far from the height of the tension that we lived a few years ago with the process. The current government issued pardons for some of the leaders, not for all, but for some of the leaders of the process. And there's been a normalization of relations with Catalonia. Support for independence in Catalonia has gone down. It sort of hovered at around 50% at the height of the process. It's now well below that. So in general terms, it feels that the pressure has diminished, but there are lingering issues that I think might still be central to this negotiation. And I think that's what we're going to see in the next few days, probably from about the mid-August onwards, when we're back, the Congress is back in session, and some of these negotiations will pick up speed. And until then, we have a government in place that is an interim government with full capacity to run affairs, but they're just waiting for these negotiations to play out.
Okay, that's super helpful. A couple more questions before we wrap up. I mean, looking at the current political climate in the United States, it's hyper polarized. the Democrats and the Republicans can hardly agree on anything, and you sort of see that play out in society as well. Are the results of Sunday's election, are they reflective of a divided Spanish society? Like, what is the state of politics on the ground with Spanish citizens currently?
Well, I mean, there are common patterns here, no? And some of us, I mean, I'm an academic by training, and I've done some work on this. And when you have high levels of inequality, of income stagnation in the middle, so you have this growing precariousness of our middle classes, that tends to produce a hollowing out of the middle of the political spectrum. And sort of that leads to political polarization and to societies that have a very hard time dialoguing and coming to consensus around things. And I think we've seen this in the US very markedly. And some of us that have been following some of the Pew polling on this, for example, in the US, the ideological self-identification of voters is more polarized as time goes by. So less and less of the US elections, including primaries, but also formal elections, are played in the middle. This is also happening in Europe. It's less intense in Spain, thankfully. So the ideological self-identification of Spaniards is not as polarized as in the US. So the voting patterns might be, and there might be an element of protest voting there, but not the self-identification. So thankfully, most Spaniards still consider themselves to be fairly moderate or centrist, which still allows for a large chunk of our elections to be played in the middle, no? Ideologically. But this is changing across time, and it's becoming tougher. And there really seem to be two blocks that don't speak to one another too intensely or too purposefully, right? And this is not uncommon. Unfortunately, we're seeing this across the advanced democracies. I happen to think that there's a very clear economic explanation for these things. I'm sure there are other factors, but I think unless we get the economics right, it's going to be very tough for us to reconstitute political dialogue and sort of cohesion within our society. So that there are real parallels here between what we're seeing in the US, in France, in the UK, and in Spain.
Okay. And then finally, what do you think that this means for Brussels and Spain's presidency of the Council of the European Union, rotating presidency?
Yeah. No, I think we'll be fine. I think the president will be fine. I think the PM has enough, and the government has enough capacity to lead on the dossiers of the presidency. There was just an important meeting, an EU CELAC, so EU, Latin America, and the Caribbean meeting that took place in Brussels. That was part of the presidency, because this is one of the major line items on the Spanish presidency, was strengthening the EU Latin American trade, political, cultural relationship, which is something that in fact the EU has not paid enough attention to. The US as well, by the way. I mean, this is a region that is in dire need of our attention and of building much stronger relations. There's going to be a leaders meeting in Granada in the fall. That will happen normally. The executive has the capacity to run and to manage all of the dossiers of the presidency. So I wouldn't be particularly concerned. I mean, one could even argue that it would have been more challenging for an incoming government in August or September to take over all of these dossiers than it is for a government that has been in place for a long time and that now gets this extension of a number of months. And by the way, this is just in the scenario that they cannot get the sufficient votes for an investiture in August, September. So this is just relevant if we go for elections again in December or January. If not, we would have a full government in place in the fall. But even if we don't, I don't see a major impact on the Spanish presidency of the EU, to be quite frank. And we've seen this in the past. I mean, I think France went through two cycles of elections, two votes in a presidential election in the middle of a presidency, and they did just fine. So, I mean, I think this is a sort of a thermometer of democratic maturity. Our countries go through elections, and these presidencies sometimes fall in electoral periods, but we should be able to run it perfectly fine.
Yeah, thermometer of democratic maturity, I think, is a good way to put it. And that's a good positive note to close the conversation on. So, Manuel, thank you so much for being with us today and for unpacking what is a pretty complicated issue. And who knows, we might have another one of these conversations at the end of the year or at the beginning of 2024, depending on what happens. So thanks so much again.
No, thank you, Rachel. A real pleasure.